Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum everyone. The topic of today's lecture is soldering and welding in dentistry. You may be familiar with these terms, but we'll be discussing them with reference to dentistry. Let's begin with the definition of a few terminologies: soldering, brazing, and welding. All of these three procedures are basically metal joining operations. So we are basically joining two metals together. So soldering is defined as the joining of metals by fusion of a filler or intermediate material, that is a third material in between at temperature below the solidus temperature of the two metals being joined, and that is always lower than 450 degrees Celsius. So this is the definition of soldering, where you're joining two metals together but by the fusion of a filler or intermediate material that is flown in between, and the temperature at which this is done is below the solidus temperature of both the metals being joined, and it is usually lower than 450 degrees Celsius. So the filler metal or the intermediate material flows into the gaps between the close fitting parts by capillary action. It then flows over the base metal. As you all know, this is called wetting, and is then cooled to join the work pieces together. So this basically defines soldering. Now, if we talk about brazing is basically what soldering, the soldering that is done in dentistry is known as brazing, and the only difference is that the temperature is higher than 450 degrees Celsius in this case. So all the brazing that is done in dentistry takes place at a temperature greater than 450 degrees C, and that is the main difference between soldering and brazing. Now, what are the main types of solders that are used in dentistry? Mainly, we use gold solders and silver solders. Gold solders consist of 40% gold, have good tarnish and corrosion resistance, and they're usually used for crown and bridge application. So, when we want to join the components of crown and bridges, we use gold solders. Silver solders are used in orthodontic appliances, for example, our arch wires, our brackets, our bands. So white solders are usually required for stainless steel and chromium based alloys for the color matching. Their formulation is similar to gold solders with the emission of gold. They have low fusing temperature, about 600 to 750 degrees, and they're used with stainless steel or other base metal alloys or wrought alloys. Their resistance to tarnish and corrosion is not good as gold solders, but they have strength that is better or comparable to gold solders. So now the soldered component is basically called a soldered joint, and it consists of the following parts: a parent or the substrate metal, which are basically being joined, the two surfaces; fluxes and antifluxes; solder or the filler material, which is the intermediate material that is flown in between the two surfaces; and obviously a heat source that is providing the source of heat, so that intermediate material gets melted and flows in between the two surfaces. So the parent metal is a metal or alloy to be joined. It is also known as a substrate metal or base metal. Soldering operation is the same for any substrate metal. So now the important thing is the composition of the parent metal, because that determines the melting range and oxides that may form on the surface during heating, and wettability or the ability of flow of the substrate by the molten solder. So what are the dental alloys that can be soldered? The gold based alloys, the nickel based, the cobalt based, and the titanium based alloys. So basically these are the alloys that can be soldered. Now, where we discussed the components, we said that it contains a parent or substrate material and also a flux. So, flux basically means to flow. And why is the flux added? So, the purpose of the flux is to remove any oxide coating on the substrate metal surface, because as you know, any kind of impurity or any oxide will prevent the intimate wetting of the third or the intermediate or the filler material, and will prevent proper joining or union of the two surfaces. So the flux removes any kind of oxide when the filler metal is fluid and ready to flow into place. Main function: protection and to prevent oxidation, dissolve the oxides, and facilitate the flow of solder. So the flux is fused onto the surface of the parent metal strip, and the amount of flux to be used is very important. If too little of flux is used, it burns off and tends to be ineffective, and excess flux remains trapped in the filler material and ultimately weakens the joint. Now we've defined the fluxes. Let's go to the classification. Fluxes may be classified according to three ways: according to their primary purpose, according to the pH, and based on the boric or borate compounds. Now, according to their primary purpose, type 1, type 2, type 3. Type 1 is the surface protection, type 2 is the reducing agent, and type 3 is the solvent. According to the pH, acidic fluxes are silicon dioxide, basic fluxes may be calcium oxide, lime, calcium carbonate, or limestone, and the neutrals may be fluorspar, which are fluoride compounds, calcium fluoride, or borax. Based on boric or borate compounds, type 1 is the protective fluxes that form a low temperature glass. Type 2 are the reducing fluxes, which have low stability and, for example, copper oxides. And type 3 are the fluoride fluxes. So the fluxes for metal alloys, noble and high noble metal alloys, the fluxes are borax or sodium tetraborate. Liquid flux may be applied for the orthodontic soldering and bridge work. Base fluxes are convenient for large bulk of flux application, and powdered fluxes are basically the reducing fluxes. So this usually is asked in MCQs, so you should have a brief idea about the fluxes used in the different metal alloys. The chromium containing alloys, however, or the base metal alloys, they contain potassium fluoride or any other fluoride as the fluxes, and equal mixture of fluoride, salt, and boric acid in a paste-like consistency. So these are the different fluxes according to the metal alloys. They're different in noble and high noble metals, usually borax or sodium tetraborate compounds. And in the base metal or chromium containing alloys, there are usually fluorides and usually potassium chloride. Now, with the flux, there is present an antiflux, which because there is basically flow within the filler metal. So, to restrict the flow of the solder, we need to use an antiflux. It is applied on the specific area where the flux should flow into, and it is applied before applying the flux or solder. Examples of antiflux are graphite in the form of lead pencil. So, basically, they are applied on those areas where the flux should flow into. Disadvantage of graphite is that it can burn off on prolonged heating. So in such cases, calcium carbonate in alcohol and water suspension is used as the antiflux. Now the requirements of an ideal solder. This is a very important question and has been asked in the UQs previously. So firstly, the flow. Ease of flow at the relatively low temperature, sufficient fluidity and wettability to freely flow when melted, ability to wet the substrate metal, and there should be intimate contact, strength compatible with that of the structure being joined, resistance to tarnish and corrosion because obviously these are also metallic alloys, acceptable color to give an inconspicuous joint. The color should be the same, should not be different, and resistance to pitting during heating. Ideally, flow temperature of the filler metal should be 56 degrees Celsius, lower than the solidus temperature of the substrate metal. If the flow temperature of the filler is above or close to solidus temperature, the alloying can take place between the substrate or the parent metal and the filler metal. So that is what that we don't want it to form an alloy. We simply want the two metal alloys to fuse together with the help of the filler metal. And obviously the alloy that is formed, if this takes place, if at higher temperature above the solidus temperature is applied, the resulting alloy will have properties different from the filler as well as the substrate. Now moving on to the heat source. The heat source is usually gas, air, or gas oxygen torch, and different fuels can be used. Hydrogen, for example, but in this case the heat content is low, so the heating is quite slow. Natural gas has heat content four times that of hydrogen. Acetylene has high flame temperature, but it is seen that there is a variation in temperature from one part of the flame to the other. and it is more than 100 degrees. So positioning of the torch is very critical. Acetylene is a chemically unstable gas. It decomposes to carbon and hydrogen, and so as a result, carbon can get incorporated to nickel and palladium alloy. Propane is the best choice. It has the highest heat and good flame temperature. Butane has similar flame temperature and heat content. Both are readily available. It is uniform in quality, virtually water-free, and it burns clean. So the best options are basically propane and butane. As you all know, the flame has four main parts: the cold mixing zone, which consists of the unburned gas, and this is the innermost zone. Then the partial combustion zone, which is the oxidizing zone. Then the reducing zone, and finally the oxidizing zone, which is composed of the burnt gas. It is always recommended that for heating and soldering, the neutral or reducing part should be used because it produces the most efficient burning and the critical heat. The position of the flame or adjustment of torch should be proper, otherwise oxidation can occur and result in a poor soldered joint. So if the unburned part of the flame is used, it may lead to incorporation of carbon in the filler or the substrate. So that is why we always use the reducing or the neutral zone, and the position of the torch is very, very important. Now there are different techniques of soldering. We won't go into the detail as we won't be asked to basically describe the techniques. However, you should know how to name a few. So there's investment soldering and free. There are other kinds of soldering, but I've just chosen these two, which are the most common. So just a brief overview of the technique. We clean and prepare the surface to be joined. We assemble the parts to be joined together. We prepare and flux the gap surfaces, apply the flux and the antiflux, maintain the proper position of the parts during the procedure, control the proper temperature, and control of time to ensure flow of the solder and complex filling of the solder joint. This is just basically a summary of the steps. Application of soldering in dentistry. Where is it used? So it's used for the soldering of inlays, crowns, fixed bridge work, removable partial dentures, and obviously orthodontic appliances. So these are the places where soldering is applied, and obviously wherever there is a metal framework involved or metal prosthesis involved, so we have to carry out soldering. Now we've discussed soldering and brazing. Let's move on to the other procedure, which is known as welding. Welding is the fusion of two pieces of similar metal under pressure, but the difference is that there is no third or intermediate material. So the two substrate metals or the parent metals must be softened by heat or compressed to achieve this. So heat and pressure or just heat can be applied, and we do not place a third or intermediate material between the two pieces like the case in soldering. It can be also defined as a process of fusing two or more metal parts through the application of heat, pressure, or both, without using filler metal to produce a localized union between two parts. So how is this achieved? It can be done by passing an electrical current through the pieces to be joined, which are pressed together tightly. The resistance offered by stainless steel to an electric current of high amperage generates enough heat to soften it. So this is the case where we are applying heat, or we can also apply pressure, or we can apply both at the same time. And the basic goal is to produce a localized union between the two metallic parts. So we there are two kinds of welding. One we discussed in the gold foil filling, which was cold welding, and this is done just by pressure or hammering or by basically pressing two pieces of gold foil together so that basically there is intimate contact and metallic bonds are formed between the two layers. And hot welding, in that we use heat of sufficient intensity to melt the metals being joined. The heat source is usually an oxyacetylene flame or high amperage electricity, as mentioned in the previous slide. Then we have pressure welding, which is done for gold foils and gold restoration by hand or mechanically. This is also a kind of pole welding. Spot welding, this is very commonly done in orthodontic appliances. Uh, Laser welding, then oxytylene welding at 6,000 degrees Celsius. This can melt all metals. And then arch welding, heat is produced from an electric arc welding machine. The arch is like a flame and of intense heat. So I deliberately did not go into too much detail. I just mentioned the names and the important welding that you should know just for general knowledge purposes. Spot welding and pole welding, which was done in gold fillings. Now, what are the factors that determine welding? The current flowing through the circuit, the time with which the current is allowed to flow, and the mechanical pressure which is applied at the welding head. Now, to end this lecture, let's look at the comparison between welding, soldering, and brazing. So, in welding, no third metal or intermediate filler metal is introduced. In soldering and brazing, the third metal is introduced. In welding, the temperature required can range up to 3800 degrees Celsius. In soldering, the temperature required is up to 450 and no more than 450. In brazing, temperature is above 450 degrees. So in welding, the workpieces are heated up to their melting point, whereas in soldering and brazing, they are not heated up to the melting point, but below their melting point. So in welding, mechanical properties may change of the metal due to high temperatures. In soldering and brazing, changes in mechanical properties of the parent metal or substrate metal is negligible. In welding, high skill level is required. Soldering cost and involvement is low, and in brazing, both cost and skill level involvement is in between the two. So in welding, no preheating is required. Soldering, preheating is required if good quality joints are desired, and in brazing, preheating is desirable. So this is a very helpful table to remember the three of these procedures, and that brings us to the end of the soldering and welding. This is also a component of metallurgy and an important one. So do go through it, and if you have any questions, do ask me. Thank you so much for your time.